fate, an hour captured by leaf, gently bear to fall, the details in between, an offering so deep. How would you massage God? Would you smother him in blazing red, canary yellow, or I'd take golden fog, mellow leaf, needle off through fingertips to deeply treat his aching back while he is so busy.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. Hi everybody, welcome to Candlelight Nook. My name is Diogo. We're doing something different today. I've got a microphone over here because we're going to share this as a podcast. The idea is that on Mondays we put out meditations to begin your week. On Wednesdays, videos that explain more in depth some popular concepts and maybe some unpopular concepts that are important in our day-to-day. And on Saturday, we do a reading. So this Saturday, we are beginning our first book together, and it's this one, The Teachings of Queen Kunti. So some background information for who is Queen Kunti and what is this book about, and why might we be interested in reading it. So Queen Kunti was the mother of the 5 Pandavas, which you may remember were the heroes of the Kurukshetra war. She was a very noble person, and she was highly spiritually realized from a very young age in life. This particular book is about prayers and homage that she gave to Krishna when he was leaving the battle of Kurukshetra after everything was said and done. The battle of Kurukshetra is the climax of the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata literally means Great India, and this is a book that is about the events leading up to the Kurukshetra battle, but also it's about the end of Dwapara Yuga and the beginning of Kali Yuga. So these prayers are originally found in the Srimad Bhagavatam, and they make up part of the 8th or 9th chapter. And this book is an elaboration on those prayers given by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. So when we come into contact with the words of self-realized individuals, those words have the potential to change the state of our consciousness. In the same way that when we see somebody laughing or when we hear somebody laughing, hysterically, we might become inspired to laugh ourselves. When we hear somebody crying, we might develop empathy for that person. When we hear a person describing the nature of a water molecule, it might get us to appreciate water and feel curious about the molecular constituents of other things in the universe. So similarly, when we hear the things that saintly people have to say, our consciousness becomes affected and imbued by the quality of what they're saying. Even misattributed quotes to Sri Buddha are often very enlightening, but anytime you hear something that Jesus or Buddha has said, it brings to mind something transcendental, uplifting, something very wise, and it's usually full of direction that we can take in our lives. And this book, The Teachings of Queen Kunti, I imagine is no exception. I say I imagine because though I have read Srimad Bhagavatam and am reading her prayers again in that book, I haven't read this one, which is an expansion on what those prayers are. So we're hoping that by hearing a very elevated, self-realized soul speak, we might be able to catch a clue as to what the nature of a self-realized soul's consciousness is. We might catch a clue as to what we can do to develop our consciousness, and hopefully we leave inspired, having taken away some practical application of the knowledge that is revealed herewith. Just checking to make sure that everything is recording. Okay. Before we begin reading sacred scripture, we try to create a nice environment in the same way that when we invite somebody to dinner at our house, or when we're going to go out on a date with somebody, or when it's movie night and we're getting the couch and the table ready, we want to create a certain environment that is conducive to the comfort of the individual that is coming. So similarly, when we read this spiritual literature, this literature that has to do with metaphysical topics, we want to create an appropriate environment within our hearts and within our minds. And so we do this by trying to clear our consciousness of any mundane conception of this literature. If it is true that self-realization is possible, and if it is true that self-realized souls are communicating to us through literature, then we want to make sure that we're receiving that message within us with the due consideration and with the utmost open-mindedness. Because contrawise, it's possible that we might miss something very important that is being said. So the standard clearing of this environment that is read, that is recited before reading the Srimad Bhagavatam is I think it's a 12-syllable. It's a 12-syllable, I was just counting it out, mantra. And it goes like this. It says, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om is the transcendental seed that indicates the spiritual reality. Namo means I offer my respect to. Bhagavate means that supreme person, or the supreme living being. And Vasudevaya refers to the son of Vasudeva, Krishna. So when we say Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We are trying to fill the space around us with spiritual sound vibration and a vibration of respect and consideration. Thank you, everyone. So thank you, everyone, for coming. And I really look forward to the opportunity of reading with you. So if anyone doesn't have this book yet, you reach out to me somehow. The Instagram is Candlelight Nook, and the Gmail is candlelightnook@gmail.com. So wherever you are in the world, we'll find a way to get this book over to you. It's very small, it's very portable, and this one's nice because it's a hard copy, so you can take it in your backpack and it won't get bent. And so I don't know how exactly it's going to go, how much we're going to read, but I'd like to release this also in a podcast format so you can listen to it wherever you are. So without further ado, let's just get into it. So there's a insert here on the first, on the inside flap, and it says, My dear Krishna, your lordship has protected us from a poisoned cake, from a great fire, from cannibals, from the vicious assembly, from sufferings during our exile in the forest, and from the great battle where great generals fought. And now you have saved us from the weapon of Ashvatthama. I wish that all those calamities would happen again and again, so that we could see you again and again. For seeing you means that we will no longer see repeated births and deaths. This is from Srimad Bhagavatam, first canto, chapter 8, verses 24 through 25. There's some beautiful images here that maybe we can share at some point. Very beautiful images. So we'll begin with the introduction. Introduction. The teachings of Queen Kunti. The tragic and heroic figure of Queen Kunti emerges from an explosive era in the history of ancient India. As related in the Mahabharata, India's great epic poem of 110,000 couplets, Kunti was the wife of King Pandu and the mother of 5 illustrious sons known as the Pandavas. As such, she was one of the central figures in a complex political drama that culminated 50 centuries ago in the Kurukshetra War, a devastating war of ascendancy that changed the course of world events. The Mahabharata describes the prelude to the Holocaust as follows. Pandu became the king because his elder brother Dhritarashtra had been born blind, a condition that excluded him from direct succession. Sometime after Pandu ascended to the throne, Dhritarashtra married Gandhari and fathered 100 sons. This was the ruling family of the Kaurava dynasty, of whom the eldest was the ambitious and cruel Duryodhana. Meanwhile, Pandu had taken 2 wives, Madri and Kunti. Originally named Pritha, Kunti was the daughter of Shurasena, the chief of the glorious Yadu dynasty. The Mahabharata relates that Kunti, quote, was gifted with beauty and character. She rejoiced in the law, dharma, and was great in her vows, end quote. She also possessed an unusual benediction. When she was a child, her father, Shurasena, had given her in adoption to his childless cousin and close friend Kunti Bhoja, hence the name Kunti. In her stepfather's house, Kunti's duty was to look after the welfare of guests. One day, the powerful sage and mystic Durvasa came there and was pleased by Kunti's selfless service. Foreseeing that she would have difficulty conceiving sons, Durvasa gave her the benediction that she could invoke any demigod and by him obtain progeny. After Kunti married Pandu, she was placed under a curse that prevented him, After Kunti married Pandu, he was placed under a curse that prevented him from begetting children. So he renounced the throne and retired with his wives to the forest. There, Kunti's special benediction enabled her to conceive, at her husband's request, 3 glorious sons. First, she invoked Dharma, the demigod of religion. After worshipping him and repeating an invocation Durvasa had taught her, she united with Dharma and, in time, gave birth to a boy. As soon as the child was born, a voice with no visible source said, "This child will be called Yudhishthira, and he will be very virtuous. He will be splendid, determined, renounced, and famous throughout the 3 worlds." Having been blessed with this virtuous son, Pandu then asked Kunti for a son of great physical strength. Thus Kunti invoked Vayu, the demigod of the wind, who begot the mighty Bhima. Upon Bhima's birth, the supernatural voice said, This child will be the foremost of all strong men." Thereafter, Pandu consulted with great sages in the forest and then asked Kunti to observe vows of austerity for 1 full year. At the end of this period, Pandu said to Kunti, "O beautiful one, Indra, the king of heaven, is pleased with you, so invoke him and conceive a son." Kunti then invoked Indra, who came to her and begot Arjuna. As soon as the prince was born, the same celestial voice boomed through the sky, "O Kunti, this child will be as strong as Kartavirya and Shibi, 2 powerful kings of Vedic times, and as invincible in battle as Indra himself. He will spread your fame everywhere and acquire many divine weapons." Subsequently, Pandu's junior wife, Madri, bore 2 sons named Nakula and Sahadeva. These 5 sons of Pandu, Yudhishthira, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sahadeva, then came to be known as the Pandavas. Now, since Pandu had retired from the throne and gone to the forest, Dhritarashtra had temporarily assumed the throne until Pandu's eldest son, Yudhishthira, came of age. However, long before that time, Pandu died as a result of the curse, and Madri gave up her life as well by ascending his funeral pyre. That left the 5 Pandavas in the care of Queen Kunti. After Pandu's death, the sages living in the forest brought the 5 young princes and Kunti to the Kaurava court at Hastinapura, present-day Delhi. In Hastinapura, the capital city of the kingdom, the 5 boys were raised in royal style under the guidance of Dhritarashtra and the noble Vidura, Pandu's half-brother. But a smooth transfer of power was not to be. Although Dhritarashtra had at first recognized the primogeniture of Yudhishthira, he later allowed himself to be used by his eldest son, the power-hungry Duryodhana, who wished to ascend the throne in place of Yudhishthira. Driven by uncontrollable jealousy, Duryodhana plotted against the Pandavas, and with the hesitant approval of the weak Dhritarashtra, he inflicted many sufferings upon them. He made several attempts on their lives in Hastinapura, and then he brought them to a provincial palace and tried to assassinate them by having it set on fire. All the while, the 5 youthful Pandavas were accompanied by their courageous mother Kunti, who suffered Duryodhana's atrocities in the company of her beloved sons. Miraculously, however, Kunti and the Pandavas repeatedly escaped death, for they were under the loving protection of Lord Krishna, who had incarnated to perform his earthly pastimes. Ultimately, Duryodhana, a clever politician, cheated the Pandavas out of their kingdom and their freedom in a gambling match. As a result of the match, the Pandavas' wife Draupadi was abused by the Kauravas, and the Pandavas themselves were forced to spend 13 years in exile in the forest, to the great sorrow of Kunti. When the 13-year exile had ended, the Pandavas returned to Hastinapura to reclaim their kingdom, but Duryodhana bluntly refused to relinquish it. Then, after some unsuccessful attempts to quell the hostilities, Yudhishthira sent Krishna himself to secure the return of the Pandava kingdom by peaceful means. But even this effort failed because Duryodhana's obstinacy, and both sides prepared for battle. To place Yudhishthira on the throne, or to oppose him, great warriors from all corners of the earth assembled, setting the scene for what would prove to be a devastating world war. Fierce fighting raged for 18 days on the historic plain of Kurukshetra near Hastinapura, and in the end, all but a handful of the many millions of warriors were dead. Only Lord Krishna, the Pandavas, and a few others survived the massacre. The Kauravas, Duryodhana and his brothers, were devastated. In a desperate gesture of revenge, Ashvatthama, one of the surviving Kauravas, mercilessly murdered the 5 sons of Draupadi while they were sleeping. Queen Kunti thus suffered a final blow, the loss of her grandchildren. Arrested and dragged to the Pandavas' camp like a bound animal, Ashvatthama was let free only by the astounding compassion of Draupadi, the slaughtered boy's mother, and Kunti's daughter-in-law, who pleaded for his life. But the shameless Ashvatthama made one more attempt to kill the last heir of the Pandavas, their unborn grandson, in the womb of Uttara, by hurling the supreme Brahmastra weapon. When she saw the missile flying straight at her, Uttara immediately ran to the shelter of Lord Krishna, who was just about to depart for Dwarka, his majestic capital city. Krishna protected the Pandavas and their mother Kunti from imminent death by stopping the weapon's uncontrollable heat and radiation with his own Sudarshana disc. Having delivered the Pandavas from this last calamity and seeing that all his plans were fulfilled, Lord Krishna was again preparing to leave. For years Duryodhana had tormented Queen Kunti's family, but Krishna had protected them at every turn, and now he was going away. Kunti was overwhelmed. She prayed to Krishna from the core of her heart. Kunti was Lord Krishna's aunt. He had incarnated as the son of her brother, Vasudeva. Yet despite this conventional tie with the Lord, she fully understood his exalted and divine identity. She knew well that he had descended from his abode in the spiritual world to rid the earth of demoniac military powers and establish righteousness. Just before the great war, Krishna had revealed all this to her son Arjuna in words immortalized in the Bhagavad Gita 4.7 through 8. Whenever and wherever there is a decline in religious practice, O descendant of Bharata, and a predominant rise of irreligion, at that time I incarnate myself, in order to deliver the pious and annihilate the miscreants, as well as to re-establish the principles of religion. I advent myself, millennium after millennium. Krishna had accomplished his purpose of, quote, annihilating the miscreants, end quote, by orchestrating the destruction of the unholy Kauravas. Then he installed Yudhishthira on the throne to establish the Pandava reign, and he consoled the slain warriors' relatives. The scene of the Lord's imminent departure provides the setting for Queen Kunti's exalted prayers. As Kunti approached the Lord's chariot and began to address him, her immediate purpose was to persuade him to remain in Hastinapura and protect the Pandavas' government from reprisals. Quote, O my Lord, are you leaving us today, though we are completely dependent on your mercy and have no one else to protect us? Now, when all kings are at enmity with us? Srimad Bhagavatam 1:8-37. From this supplication, we should not mistakenly conclude that Kunti's prayers were self-serving. Although her sufferings were far greater than those any ordinary person could endure, she does not beg relief. On the contrary, she prays to suffer even more. For she reasons that her suffering will increase her devotion to the Lord and bring her ultimate liberation. My dear Krishna, your lordship has protected us from the poisoned cake, from a great fire, from cannibals, from the vicious assembly, from sufferings during our exile in the forest, and from the battle where great generals fought. I wish that all those calamities would happen again and again so that we could see you again and again, for seeing you means that we will no longer see repeated births and deaths. Kunti's words, the simple and illuminating outpouring of the soul of a great and saintly woman devotee, reveal both the deepest transcendental emotions of the heart and the most profound philosophical and theological penetrations of the intellect. Her words of glorification impelled by a divine love steeped in wisdom. Quote, O Lord of Madhu, as the Ganges forever flows to the sea without hindrance, let my attraction be constantly drawn unto you without being diverted to anyone else. Kunti's spontaneous glorification of Lord Krishna and her description of the spiritual path are immortalized in the Mahabharata and the Bhagavata Purana, Srimad Bhagavatam. And they have been recited, chanted, and sung by sages and philosophers for thousands of years. As they appear in the first canto of the Bhagavatam, Queen Kunti's celebrated prayers consist of only 26 couplets, verses 18 through 43 of the 8th chapter, yet they are considered a philosophical, theological, and literary masterpiece. The present book, Teachings of Queen Kunti, includes those inspired verses and illuminating commentary by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness and the most renowned Vedic scholar and spiritual leader of our time. In addition to this commentary, originally written in 1962, Teachings of Queen Kunti contains further explanations that Srila Prabhupada gave more recently in an absorbing series of lectures. In those memorable talks delivered in the spring of 1973 at ISKCON's Western World Headquarters in Los Angeles, he analyzed the verses in significantly greater detail and shed even more light upon them. This new Bhaktivedanta Book Trust publication, complete with 11 color prints of exquisite original oil paintings, will be a prized addition to the libraries of all those who seek a deeper understanding of life's mysteries. Written by one of profound devotion and erudition, it will provide every reader with firm guidance along the universal path to general wisdom and spiritual enlightenment. There's a lot to unpack there. That's I heard once that it's very good to read everything. Read as much as you can. When we open a book, we should even read the table of contents, which I'll read on my own. I won't, put everyone else through it. But I thought that the format of our reading can go like this: that we read something together and then we discuss something together. So, still recording. Let's put it over here. So, since it's just me talking today, I'll have to imagine some questions that people would ask. Excuse me. Some things still stick out to me. So I think that the first consideration is the consideration about demigods. The Vedic literatures describe the universe cosmology in two distinct ways. One way that they describe the Vedic cosmology is in terms of the physical and visible. So they talk about interplanetary distance, the distance to the nearest star, the shape of the universe. And another aspect, another part of the Vedic literatures describe the dimensional layers of reality. So they will describe higher, what they call celestial beings, intermediary planetary systems where human beings like us reside, and then subterranean or lower life forms. So an analogy that helps me understand this is that in the same way that an ant and I can be on the same floor, and I can be aware of the ant's nature, but the ant has no frame of reference with which to understand my nature, because I exist completely mostly out of its reference or vantage point. So the ant can see that my foot goes, in front of the anthill, but it doesn't have a word for a foot, or maybe even for an anthill. It just knows that there's a change in the nature of, the architecture of its anthill. It notices that, when my foot goes on it and steps on it, it moves and disrupts it. So the ant can recognize that there's a changing nature, but it might not see the cause of that changing nature. Similarly, the higher planetary beings are in control of the nature that affects us. So we have descriptions of a god that's in charge of the rain, and a god that's in charge of the movement of the planetary systems, and that's in charge of wind, that's in charge of the movement of the seas. And all great manifestations of nature are ultimately put into the control or power of delegated individuals who are called demigods, or suras in Sanskrit. So this is not even the wildest claim of the Vedic literatures. And so what do we do with that information? Do we look at what the Vedic literatures are saying as an analogy or a metaphor trying to explain something else? Do we look at it as a mythology created by people that didn't understand the components of the universe? Do we take it seriously but not literally? Or do we take it literally and do we take it seriously? The view of higher dimensional beings is not something that science, as of yet, our empirical science, or in other words, that science that deals with quantities, observable quantities that can, reproduce experiments to show results, that science has not revealed to us these higher planetary beings. But that is not a disqualification on the truthfulness of such claims. We know that in scientific experiments, we usually put things that are under our control to the test. So now if the Vedic literatures are claiming that there are beings that are not controlled by us, then by definition, we can't put them under an experiment because we can't control them. This is the same reason why science can't reveal God, because God is a higher ontological category than the experimenter. So we can't use the same type of scientific process to reveal God, but there is a scientific methodology by which his person can be known to the individual. So that's the first point, that we may be going into, so we're going into a Vedic text right now, and it has a worldview that vastly differs from our own, because the worldview in the Vedic literatures is based on personalism. In the ultimate instance, everything is fundamentally a person or an individual in the Vedic literature, and that personhood is coming from the fact of the atomic soul. So that's something that we're going to be confronting. The second thing that stuck out to me was the weaponry. So they're claiming that 50 centuries ago, a great weapon, a Brahmastra, existed, and that Brahmastra is described like a nuclear weapon. So something that helps me understand this is to consider the technology that exists today in 2020, and what it would be like to tell somebody in 1800 about what exists. So you and I right now are 220 years ahead in time of somebody in the 1800s. So if we were to go back in time and to explain somebody what we could do, it would sound something like this if we tried to use, simple terms and not any of the names for our technology. We would say, well, you can speak to a small handheld device that captures your image and your voice, and by transferring it to very small bits of very small pieces, then you can send those images simultaneously to anyone around the world that has a similar device or contraption. We have black discs that can we can impress real sound onto black circular discs, so like records, you know what I mean, and CDs. We have devices that are shaped like birds whose wings do not flap, that are propelled by powerful jets of air that help them overcome the pull of gravity to become airborne. So, though that technology exists to us 220 years in the past, all of the systems and all of the logic that needs to be kind of taken for granted for a thing like a cell phone to exist, we take for granted, but they may not. Now, the interesting thing is that to imagine that 220 years before the 1800s, so, like 1580, that this was still a possibility. It's not that this technology is following laws that are only true in 2020. These laws were in place in 1560, just people didn't know about it. So now what the Vedic literatures are claiming is that these technologies were true thousands and thousands of years ago, but they weren't being accessed by gross material means, but rather they were being accessed by subtle technologies. So what does that mean? That means that today, nuclear weapons are based on a process of nuclear fission. So what's done is a uranium core is a uranium atom or molecule is split, and then that causes a chain reaction of splitting other uranium atoms, and that process creates a lot of heat and a lot of light and a lot of energy released, and then that causes a massive explosion. But that you can split anything, right? Like you could split they split H bombs before. So what they were doing in Vedic times was basically the same law was being followed, but it wasn't being done through a material means. So whereas now we have a big missile that performs that fission reaction, back then through the use of sound and vibration, they would cause that to happen. Why? A nuclear missile is made of metal, for example, that comes out of the earth, and a whole bunch of transformations of earth, so different degrees of earth. You can think of when you make a tofu preparation. When I make tofu, I use coconut cream as kind of the creamy base, and then I use coconut oil to make it, easier to mix. And then I use coconut sugar on top of it. So these are 3 different materials that have come out of one coconut. It's just been transformed in a different way. So similarly, a bomb is the same element, earth, just transformed in a different way. So you have metal for the casing, you have the atoms, which are really, and the molecules, which are really small parts of earth, and then that's supposed to, create some kind of friction that generates fire. And we do that with wood also. We can generate friction with some sticks and then create fire. It's just the kind of fire that we're creating in a bomb by rubbing these material elements together is much greater and of a lot more focused nature. However, if you know the name of the deity that is in charge of earth, if you know the name of the deity that is in charge of the expansion of fire, then why would you have to go through the process of manipulating the elements on your own when you could just ask them to bring it together to you? So this is a very crude example of how people were able to do things in Vedic times by the use of mantras. In contemporary society, we're very familiar with how spells work. The whole principle behind spells is that my words are connected to reality in some way. And if I can say the words in the right combination, then the intention that I want to manifest in the world will be aligned to the strength of the vibration of my charm or my mantra or my just vibration. This is a very subtle science, but if the entire world is made out of progressive vibration stacked upon each other, then if you could access the frequency, the lowest frequency of vibration, or rather the highest frequency of vibration that could affect the other one stacked on top of it, then by reciting mantra in the proper way, you can change you can affect the nature of the world in small ways. So that is the best explanation, or that's the way that I understand how this happened. What else? So it's talking about the content of Queen Kunti's heart. And so it's given the context of the Battle of Kurukshetra. So let's come back to those other things. We should remember that the Vedic literatures are trying to direct our consciousness to a transcendental reality. The Vedic literatures are not interested in attracting us to the beauty of the material world, so to speak. It's the Vedic literatures are actually a program that's supposed to get you to be aware of constantly higher and higher truths. And these Vedic literatures were put to paper, or they were put to be written some 5,000 years ago. But before that, the Vedic literatures were given from spiritual master to disciple through oral tradition. We're at a time right now in history that the Vedic literatures are being given to us by primarily A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. And he took as his life's mission a very specific function of delivering love of God to Western countries that are full of impersonalism and voidism. So the Vedic literatures that we're accessing are done with a very specific function in mind, and that function is to uplift the consciousness of the individual as fast as possible, to come to understand the conclusion of all knowledge, which is that everything comes from God, Everyone has a relationship with God, and the perfection of life is to develop and realize that relationship. This is called self-realization, and to come to love that person. So we'll find that expressed in the Bible when Jesus says, you should love your neighbor as yourself, and later, you should love your neighbor as I have loved you, and love God above all things. So this is really the purpose of religion, to know what the source of existence is and to develop a relationship. And the best kind of relationship is a relationship based on love. So A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, he's coming from this tradition that has all of this knowledge about fantastic realities within the material world, and he's almost presenting it to us as a parenthetical notation of, by the way, this also happened. But the principal message that he's trying to deliver is that God is a person, and God is interacting with individuals, that person's name is Krishna, and that anyone can have a relationship with Krishna by saying his name in a devotional mood. So this is what's interesting, is that it hasn't been recorded in human history within the last 2,000 years that a spiritual teacher that has come to revolutionize the consciousness in the entire world has based their teaching on such a profound corpus of knowledge and not really bothered with all of the lower implications of that corpus of knowledge, such as demigods, the existence of demigods, or flying saucers or interplanetary beings. It's almost like anytime that he'll mention these things, it's as though they're a distraction. They're something that's getting in the way of your relationship with God. And so this is a very interesting attitude, because other people are interested in the Vedic literatures for that express purpose, because they have knowledge about demigods, or because they speak about reincarnation and the constitution of the soul, or they describe mystic powers like being able to walk on water and levitate. But Srila Prabhupada isn't interested in all that. Srila Prabhupada is saying the conclusion of knowledge is to know who God is. And this is the spirit that we should go into these literatures with. So we have to do two jobs at the same time. We have to simultaneously know that that is our north. While we read these literatures, we want to read the Vedic literature with the idea that this is supposed to reveal to me who God is, who I am, and what my relationship is. And at the same time, we have to fend off or keep ourselves from being distracted by these different layers of reality, by these different nuances of laws that we have no idea about. For example, in the United States, we come to accept our constitutional rights and the freedom of the press, but in another country, those laws don't exist. So if I'm trying to describe to you, my favorite food, and I describe another country that just so happens to not have those laws, and you get distracted with, wait, what do you mean there's no freedom of the press? And I'm just trying to describe baklava, then you're not going to understand what I really want to tell you. And ultimately, what's more important? So in this situation, baklava is not as important than freedom of the press. But in this situation, knowing that there's such a thing as a self-realized soul, and knowing that there is that God is a person, is definitely the most important part of this literature. And it's not that there are other beings that are in higher dimensional realms, just like there are beings that are in lower dimensional realms. I mean, if we think about it analytically, how could we be so presumptuous to assume, to come into our scientific conversation with the presupposition that we must be the highest we must inhabit the highest ontological category of conscientiousness? That's very bold. And that's not scientific. It's not academic, or there's no scientific integrity behind the claim that we are the highest conscious living beings in all of existence, or that the evolutionary process as we've seen it is the main branch of the evolutionary process. Who's to say that there aren't branches of the evolutionary process that have, peaked or that have bent above our realm of perception? In the same way that there are things happening above the clouds, but the clouds cover our vision, who's to say that we haven't evolved in such a way to just notice one aspect of reality while another branch of an evolutionary process is continuing in another one? I'm not, making a particular case for evolution or not. I'm simply making a thought experiment as to why it is more philosophically sound to accept, at least in theory, the existence of higher dimensional beings than to reject them outright. So I think that this is a good stopping point. We got through the entire introduction, and so we'll continue every Saturday, hopefully being able to make it through one chapter. I would really love to see what you all have to say. You can find this podcast at Apple Podcasts, and you can also listen to it as a video on YouTube. Or if you need, you can write me an email and I'll send you a downloadable link. This is Candlelight Nook. My name is Diogo, and I'm very grateful to have been able to read and talk to you about some enlightening subject matter that simply discussing and listening to has the potential of changing our lives. Take care, and I'll see y'all next week.
Left hand is for the sweeper, with the right he does the rest. Left hand is for the sweeper, with the right he does the rest. Resting place of